Queen Claire stood at the top of the broken stone steps of her throne hall. The banners that once showed the pride of her people hung in shreds, burned and torn by the men who had betrayed her. Smoke filled the air, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the walls. Her people had fought bravely, but now only a few defenders remained. The enemy closed in from all sides, armored men with blades and shields, marching with the weight of certain victory. She held her last spear in her hands, the shaft cracked near the middle from the battles of the night. Her arms shook with strain, but she refused to show weakness. Around her, fallen guards lay where they had made their last stand. Claire's crown was gone, her gown was torn, and her blood mixed with the dirt at her feet, but her eyes burned with defiance. The enemy captain shouted for her to surrender. He promised mercy if she bent her knee. She spat on the floor and raised her broken spear. She had been born a queen, and she would die a queen. The first wave of enemy soldiers rushed up the steps. Claire struck one across the face, spun, and drove the cracked spear into another man's chest. She tore it free, but the wood groaned and splintered. She slashed with the sharp end again and again, striking with all her strength. The bodies of her foes fell at her feet, but more came behind them. Sweat dripped into her eyes. Her breathing grew ragged. Her spear cracked further with every strike, until at last it snapped in half against the shield of a tall soldier. The force threw her back a step, and the broken shaft fell from her hands. Gasps rose from the hall. Claire stood unarmed, surrounded by steel. Soldiers pressed closer, their blades raised high. She clenched her fists, ready to fight with nothing but her hands. She thought of her people hiding in the ruins, of the ones who still believed she could save them. She thought of her family, all taken by the same men who now closed in. Her chest rose with one last breath. The enemy captain gave the order to strike, swords lifted and shields locked. Claire braced herself for the final moment. Then the ground shook with a deafening roar. The walls trembled as a bright fire tore across the sky. Every soldier froze, their eyes turning upward. A blazing shape fell through the smoke above the ruined hall. It cut through the air like a burning star and crashed into the ground with a blast that sent stone and dust flying. Claire shielded her eyes as the shockwave rolled across the steps. Soldiers were thrown aside, their ranks broken. When the dust began to clear, a figure stood in the crater. It was a man, tall and broad, his body wrapped in strange armor that gleamed even through the dirt. In his hands, he carried a weapon unlike any Claire had ever seen. His eyes burned with a cold fury as he looked upon the soldiers who had been moments from killing her. The silence broke when the man moved. He charged forward with a speed that no eye could follow. His weapon struck with thunder, cutting down the first line of soldiers in a single sweep. Blades clashed against his armor but slid away uselessly. He struck again, and with each movement, another enemy fell. Claire stared in shock. The man fought as though he had descended from the heavens to bring death to her foes. The soldiers who had mocked and threatened her now screamed in fear as they faced him. He moved through them like a storm, tearing their formation apart. In that moment, as dust and smoke swirled, Claire felt something she had not felt in many days. Hope. The man who had fallen from the sky stood among the shattered stones, his weapons still glowing with strange power. The enemy soldiers who had been bold a moment before now stumbled back in fear. None of them had seen a warrior like him. His armor caught the fading light, and his steps rang heavy as he advanced. Claire stood at the top of the steps, her breath caught in her throat. She had thought her end was certain. Now she watched as this stranger cut through the men who had sworn to kill her. He moved like a beast in battle, but every strike was sharp and sure. The enemy captain shouted for his men to hold the line, tried to rally them, waving his sword high, but the stranger leveled his weapon. A thunderous shot tore through the air, and the captain was thrown back lifeless to the stones. The men who had once followed him broke apart in panic. Some fled into the ruins, others tried to fight, but they fell one by one. The man from the sky did not stop until no soldier still stood before him. The hall that had been filled with the clash of blades was silent now, except for the groans of the dying. Claire stepped down slowly, her hands shaking. She did not know whether to fear this stranger or thank him. Her broken spear lay at her feet, useless now, and without him, she would have been another body among the fallen. The man turned toward her. His eyes were sharp, his face marked by dirt and smoke, but his expression was calm, did not bow. He simply stood, breathing hard, his weapon still in his grip. "Who are you?" Claire asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced. The man's gaze lingered on her for a long moment. At last he answered in a low voice, "My name is John." The name was plain, but nothing about him was plain. Claire searched his face for lies, but found none. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "I did not come to take your crown," he said. "I came because I heard the cry of a land in chains. I will not watch men burn a kingdom to ashes. I fight where I am needed." His words struck her as strange, for no rider had gone beyond the borders to call for help. Yet he had arrived in her darkest hour. She wanted to question him further, but the clash of steel echoed from outside the broken hall. More enemy soldiers were approaching. John looked to her. "Do you stand with me?" he asked. Claire lifted her chin. She was a queen, her crown or no crown, and she would not hide while another fought in her place. She picked up the broken half of her spear and gripped it tight. "I will stand with you," she said. Together they moved to the steps as fresh enemies poured into the ruins. John fired his weapon, cutting down the first ranks. Claire struck with her broken spear, swift and ruthless, finishing the wounded who reached them. The two fought as one, her speed weaving with his power. Blood stained the stones, and the cries of battle rose again. The enemy had thought the queen finished, but now she stood alive with a warrior beside her. The fight raged until the last of the attackers lay dead or fled into the night. When it was done, Claire leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling with every breath. John stood watch, scanning the shadows for more foes. "You've saved me," Claire said at last, "but I do not understand why. No man gives his life for strangers." John looked at her, his voice steady. "I do not fight for strangers. I fight for what is right. If you are queen, then your people need you alive, and now they will see you rise again." His words carried a weight that stirred her heart. She had nearly given herself to death, but this man had reminded her that the battle was not over. Somewhere beyond the walls, her people waited, beaten and afraid. Perhaps with this warrior at her side, they could rise once more. The night grew quiet, the fires burned low, and the bodies of the fallen lay across the stones. Claire stood straight, the broken spear still in her hand, and looked at John. For the first time in many days, she felt that her kingdom might yet be saved. The ruins of the throne hall smoldered through the night. Claire and John stood at the edge of the broken wall, watching as the enemy withdrew into the dark hills. The Queen's city had been torn apart, yet in the silence after battle, she felt a strange strength growing within her. The people who had fled into hiding now crept back to the open, their faces pale and uncertain. When they saw their queen still standing, their voices rose in cries of hope. John turned his weapon to his side and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "The enemy will come again. They will not accept defeat. If you want to live, you must learn to fight." The villagers gathered, men and women alike, holding tools instead of swords. They had lived under the shadow of the warlords for too long. Claire stepped forward and raised her broken spear. "He is right. If we wait, they will return and burn what little we have left. But if we rise now, we can strike before they gather strength." The people looked at her and then at John. Something in his presence gave them courage. Slowly, they knelt before their queen, swearing their loyalty once more. Claire felt the fire of command return to her heart. She had thought her reign ended, but now she stood ready to lead again. In the days that followed, John trained them. He moved across the camp with tireless energy, showing them how to hold a blade, how to stand in a line, how to shield one another. He carved wooden weapons for practice and drilled them until their arms shook. The people cursed their weakness, but they did not stop, for John's voice drove them harder than fear itself. Claire watched with sharp eyes. She joined the training, refusing to stand apart. Though her arms still bled from the wounds of battle, she fought among them, striking until her hands blistered. Her presence lit their hearts, for if their queen could bleed beside them, then no man could claim they were cowards. At night by the fires, John and Claire spoke of plans. He drew lines in the dirt, showing how to ambush supply lines and strike at weak points. She told him of the land of secret paths, rivers, and ruined forts hidden in the forest. Together they forged a plan not of survival, but of resistance. Their first strike came before dawn. A band of enemy soldiers marched through the valley with stolen grain. Claire led her new fighters down from the hills. John moved like a shadow among them, silent until the moment of the attack. When the signal came, the villagers surged forward with cries of rage. The enemy tried to form ranks, but John was already upon them. His weapon roared, cutting through their line, while Claire drove her broken spear into the heart of their captain. The ambush ended swiftly. For the first time, the villagers tasted victory. They seized the grain and returned to the ruins with cheers. Claire raised her weapon and declared that the rebellion had begun. Yet she knew the cost would be great. The warlords would not ignore these strikes. They would gather more men and march with fury to crush her. But she did not fear, for John stood at her side. His skill was beyond any she had seen, and his resolve never wavered. Still, questions burned in her mind. One night, as the camp slept, she sat by the fire with John. The flames cast shadows on his face, but his eyes never left the horizon. "Why do you fight for me?" she asked. "You came from the sky like a fire. No man does that without reason." John's gaze did not shift. His voice was steady and low. "I fight because I cannot watch injustice. I have seen kingdoms rise and fall. I have seen men betray their own blood. But when I saw your land burning, I knew my place was here." Claire studied him, searching for truth. She saw no greed, no hunger for power, only an iron will. She gave a small nod. "Then you will not fight alone," she said. At that moment, a bond formed between them, not of crown and servant, but of warriors bound by battle. Together they would strike again, and with each strike, the chains on her people would weaken. The fires of rebellion had been lit, and neither queen nor warrior would let them die. The rebellion spread like fire across the land. Villagers whispered the name of their queen once more, not in fear of death, but in hope of freedom. Men and women who had once bowed to the warlords now took up arms. Every victory gave them strength. Every raid filled their hearts with courage. John drilled them without mercy. He made them march until their legs shook, forced them to fight through pain and exhaustion, and demanded that no man or woman break formation. Many cursed him in silence, but when battle came, they saw the truth. His way kept them alive. Claire rode at the front of every strike. She refused to lead from safety, her broken spear always in hand. She showed her people that she was not only their queen, but also their comrade. She bled with them, fought beside them, and mourned the fallen with them. Her presence turned frightened villagers into soldiers. The warlords felt the sting of her return. Their patrols vanished in the forests, their supply wagons burned on the roads, their forts taken by sudden assault. Rage spread among them, and they swore to end her rebellion, before it grew beyond their grasp. They sent larger forces, better armed and led by seasoned captains. One evening, scouts rushed back to the rebel camp with grave news. A force twice the size of Claire's army was marching toward them. The warlords meant to crush the rebellion in a single blow. Fear spread quickly. Many of the villagers had never faced such numbers. Claire stood before them, her face stern, her voice carrying over the camp. "If we run, they will hunt us down one by one. If we kneel, they will chain us and burn our homes. There is only one choice left. We fight." Words steadied them, but it was John who gave them a plan. He gathered the leaders and drew lines in the dirt. He explained how to lure the enemy into a valley, how to block their retreat, how to strike from both sides at once. His mind worked like a blade, sharp and relentless. When dawn broke, the rebels waited in silence along the rocky cliffs of the valley. John moved among them, checking every line, every trap, every hidden fighter. Claire stood on the ridge, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She felt the weight of her crown, even though it no longer rested on her head. This battle would decide whether her people rose or fell forever. The enemy came with banners high and steel flashing in the morning sun. They marched with confidence, shouting curses at the rebels they thought were broken peasants. As they entered the valley, the ground shook with their numbers. At John's signal, the rebels struck. Arrows rained from the cliffs, rocks tumbled down, crushing men and breaking formations. Claire led the charge from the ridge, her warriors screaming with fury as they poured into the valley.
Ow.
The warlords' men fought back hard. Steel clashed against steel, the valley echoing with cries of pain and rage. Claire fought at the front, her broken spear stabbing and slashing without pause. She moved like a flame, cutting through the enemy ranks. Her people followed her, their courage fueled by her presence. John fought where the battle was thickest. His weapon thundered, each strike cutting down foes who dared to face him. He moved with ruthless precision, never faltering, never slowing. When a line of enemy soldiers tried to break through, he stood alone against them, holding the ground until his fighters closed in behind him. The battle raged for hours. Blood stained the stones, and bodies covered the ground. Yet the rebels did not break. For every villager who fell, 2 more pressed forward with fury. Claire's voice rose above the clash, calling her people to stand firm. At last, the enemy captain fell beneath John's strike. The warlord's banner dropped into the dirt, and their men began to scatter. The valley that had once echoed with their war cries now filled with the cheers of the rebels. The cost was heavy, but the victory was theirs. Claire stood in the midst of the wounded and the dead, her chest rising with pride and grief. She knew the war was far from over. The warlords would not stop until they crushed her, and greater battles lay ahead. Yet as she looked at John, standing tall with his weapon still in his grip, she felt the fire of hope burn brighter than ever. Together they had turned frightened villagers into a force that could stand against an army. Together they would march on, no matter the price. The valley battle had given the rebels their greatest victory, but the cost of blood weighed heavily. Claire moved through the camp, speaking to the wounded, holding the hands of the dying, and listening to the cries of those who had lost family. She showed no tears, though her heart was torn. Her people looked to her for strength, and she would not let them see weakness. John remained apart, sharpening his blade in silence. He did not join the mourning, for he knew the warlords would strike again soon. Victory meant little if they did not prepare for what was coming. He watched every fire, every guard post, every supply wagon, searching for weakness. Among the rebels, not all hearts were loyal. Ethan, one of Claire's trusted captains, grew restless. He had fought bravely at her side, but greed gnawed at him. The warlords sent secret word, promising him gold, land, and power if he turned against the queen. Temptation poisoned his mind, and soon he agreed to betray the very cause he had sworn to defend. At night, when the camp slept, Ethan slipped away. He carried with him maps of the valley, the strength of their forces, and the plans for their next strike, crossed the hills under the cover of darkness, and delivered them into the hands of the warlords. The next evening, as the rebels rested, a sudden roar split the night. Fires rose at the edge of the camp as enemy soldiers stormed through the trees. The rebels were caught unprepared, scattered and half-armed. Panic spread as men and women rushed to form ranks. Claire seized her spear and ran into the chaos, shouting for her people to stand together. John was already in the fight, his weapon blazing as he cut down wave after wave of attackers. But the enemy knew their camp too well. They struck at the weakest points, pushing through the defenses with brutal force. The rebels fought with courage, but the surprise attack drove them back step by step. Fires consumed tents and supplies. Screams filled the air as steel clashed in every corner. Claire struck down an enemy captain with her broken spear, but the weight of numbers pressed in around her. John forced his way to her side. "We must fall back," he said. "If we stay, we will be crushed." Claire's heart burned with rage. She saw her people cut down, their hard-won hope drowning in blood. But she knew John was right. To stay would mean death for all. She raised her voice and ordered the retreat. Her fighters pulled back into the forest, leaving the camp to burn behind them. When at last they reached safety in the dark hills, the survivors gathered in silence. Their faces were pale, their bodies covered in ash and blood. The flames of their camp lit the sky, a cruel reminder of what they had lost. Claire stood before them, her spear dark with blood. Her voice was steady, though her chest shook. "We have been struck, but we are not broken. We live, and while we live, our fight continues." John stepped forward, his eyes fierce. "Someone gave them our plans. They knew too much. One among us betrayed you." The words cut through the camp like a blade. Murmurs rose, suspicion spreading. Claire's gaze swept across her captains. She thought of Ethan, his eyes always shifting, his questions always too sharp. She knew then who had turned against her. Her hands tightened on her spear. "Ethan has betrayed us," she said. "He has sold us for gold. He will answer for this." The rebels cried out in anger, their grief turning to fury. They swore they would not rest until the traitor was brought down. John placed a hand on his weapon. Then we hunt him. And when we find him, no wall or army will shield him from justice. Claire looked out at her broken camp, her people huddled in the night, and the fire in her heart grew stronger. They had been wounded, but not defeated. She swore that Ethan and the warlords would pay for every drop of blood spilled. The rebellion would not die. It had only begun. The days after the attack were heavy with anger and loss. Smoke from the burned camp still stained the sky, and the rebels moved like shadows through the hills. They carried little but their weapons and their rage. Claire walked among them, speaking few words, yet every man and woman felt her fire. John stayed at her side, silent and sharp, his eyes always watching the horizon. Ethan's betrayal spread like poison through the camp. The fighters cursed his name, swearing death upon him. Claire said nothing, but in her heart she carved his fate. She would not forgive. Scouts soon brought word. The warlords had gathered their forces greater than before. Their banners rose across the plains, their camps thick with soldiers. At their head stood Ethan, armored in stolen steel, carrying the gold promised to him. He commanded the very men who had burned his own people. John studied the reports with cold focus. "They mean to end us in one battle," he said. "They gather all they have. If we wait, they will hunt us down piece by piece. We must strike first." Claire nodded. "Then we make our stand. Not in hiding, not in fear. We meet them where all can see, and we break them." The rebels prepared through the night. Weapons were sharpened, arrows fletched, and broken armor patched. Farmers who had once carried plows now carried blades. Children too young to fight carried water and bandages. Every hand was set to the task. None wished to kneel again. At dawn, the two armies faced each other on the plain. The warlords' force stretched wide, shields gleaming, voices roaring with confidence. At their center, Ethan sat upon a black horse, his sword raised high, his eyes fixed on the queen he had betrayed. Claire stood at the front of her army, her torn cloak whipping in the wind. Her broken spear rested in her grip, its edge sharpened once more. John stood beside her, his weapon humming with power. The rebels behind them beat their shields, their voices rising in a single cry. The battle began with a thunder of feet. The warlords' men charged, their wall of steel rushing forward. Claire lifted her spear and shouted for her people to hold. Arrows flew from the rebel lines, cutting down the first wave. The crash of impact shook the ground as steel met steel. John plunged into the front line, his weapon tearing through armor and bone. He fought like a storm, every strike leaving death in its path. Claire fought at his side, her spear flashing, her movements quick and sure. She cut through men with fury, her voice rising to drive her people forward. The plain became a sea of blood. Men fell, screaming, banners burned, and the air filled with the clash of blades. The rebels fought with the strength of desperation, every swing fueled by rage and hope. The warlord's soldiers pressed hard, but they could not break the line. Through the chaos, Ethan rode forward. His black horse reared as he called for the rebels to surrender. Claire answered with a charge. She struck at his guards, her spear finding gaps in their armor. John cut down those who blocked her path, his weapon roaring in his hands. At last, Claire faced Ethan. He sneered, his sword gleaming in the sun. "You should have bowed when you had the chance," he said. Claire's eyes burned with fire. "You should have stayed loyal." Their blades clashed with a scream of steel. Ethan struck with brute strength, forcing her back. Claire moved fast, dodging his heavy blows, her spear darting like lightning. He laughed, pressing harder, but she did not falter. John fought off the guards around them, clearing the field so the two could face each other. Blood streaked his armor, yet his eyes never left Claire. Ethan raised his sword for a killing blow, but Claire twisted aside and drove her spear deep into his chest. His eyes widened with shock. The gold and promises of the warlords slipped from his hands as he fell from the saddle. Claire pulled her weapon free and watched him die in the dirt. The rebels saw it and roared with triumph. The sight of Ethan's fall broke the enemy's spirit. Their lines wavered, then shattered. John pressed forward, leading the charge that drove them from the field. The warlords' banners fell one by one, trampled in the mud. When the battle ended, the plain was silent save for the cries of the wounded. Claire stood over Ethan's body, her spear dripping with his blood. John placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "The traitor is gone, but the war is not finished." She lifted her head, her eyes on the horizon. "Then we will finish it. No more hiding, no more running. We take back the throne." The plain of victory still smelled of smoke and blood when the survivors gathered. Claire stood before them, her broken spear in her grip, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Round her the rebels knelt and swore again that they would follow her to the end. She lifted her head toward the horizon, where the warlords still held the great city. She knew the last battle waited there. John moved among the fighters, checking their weapons and armor, silent as always. His presence was steady, a wall of iron that never wavered. The rebels drew strength from him as much as from their queen. They had beaten the traitor, but they all knew the warlords would not surrender easily. At dawn, the army marched. They moved through valleys, across rivers, and over burned fields. Villagers came out to cheer them, bringing food and water, and some joined the march, carrying whatever weapons they could find. With every step, the Queen's army grew. When they reached the city, the walls rose tall and grim before them. The gates were barred, the towers lined with archers, and behind them waited the last host of the warlords. The enemy was greater in number, but the rebels were hardened by fire and loss. Claire rode to the front, her voice carried across the field. "This is our land. This is our home. No man has the right to chain it. Today we take it back." Her words lit the hearts of her army, and they answered with a roar. John lifted his weapon, his eyes cold with focus. He gave the signal, and the assault began. Arrows darkened the sky as the rebels charged. Shields rose, men fell, but still they pressed forward. They slammed against the gates with rams fashioned from fallen trees. Towers rained death, yet John's weapon struck with thunder, tearing holes in the defenses. The gates splintered under the fury of the assault. With a final crash, it broke, and the rebels poured into the city streets. The warlord's soldiers met them in a tide of steel. Clash was fierce, echoing through every alley and square. Claire fought at the front, her broken spear flashing in the light. She cut through men with skill and fury, never slowing, never yielding. John fought beside her, every strike of his weapon sending enemies sprawling. The rebels followed their lead, turning the streets red with battle. In the heart of the city, the warlords gathered in the throne hall that once belonged to Claire. Formed a shield wall, their best men surrounding them. Shouted curses at the queen, daring her to face them. Claire did not hesitate. She led her fighters through the ruined gates of her hall. Memories of the day she lost it burned in her mind, but she pushed them aside. This was not the day of her fall. This was the day of her return. The fight within the hall was savage. Steel rang against stone, banners fell from the walls, and fire spread across the floor. John tore through the shield wall, his weapon breaking their line. Claire struck at the warlords themselves, her spear driving with all the strength of her people behind it. One by one, the warlords fell. Some fought to the last, others tried to flee, but none escaped. The throne hall that had once been filled with her enemies now lay covered in their blood. At last, silence fell. Claire stood before her throne, her chest rising with heavy breaths. The broken spear dripped red, her hands trembling from the weight of battle. She turned slowly and faced her people. They filled the hall, bloodied and weary, yet their eyes shone with pride. They looked to her not only as a queen, but as the heart of their victory. John stood at her side, his armor battered, his weapon lowered, his face calm as ever. Claire climbed the steps and placed her hand upon the throne. She did not sit, not yet. She raised her spear high, and her voice rang through the hall. "The warlords are finished. This land is free." Roar rose from her people, echoing off the broken walls, shaking the city with the sound of triumph. The first time in years, the crown of the kingdom was no longer in chains. John looked to the stars through a gap in the roof. His duty was not bound to one throne, but tonight he remained. He had come when the queen's spear broke, and death was near. He had fought beside her through blood and fire. Now he stood in the hall of victory, silent but watchful, ready for whatever storms might come. The kingdom was restored, and the people were free.